The psychologist was sweating. Not nervous sweating. The kind of sweat that comes when a man realizes the room he thought he controlled has quietly been rearranged around him, and he is only now noticing. Dr. Philip Hargrove sat in the witness chair of Courtroom 4B in Birchfield County Courthouse and looked at the evaluation he had submitted 3 weeks ago, the one with Jasmine Carter's name at the top and lies on every page, and said, out loud, into a live microphone, in front of a judge. The psychological evaluation I submitted is not an accurate clinical document. The room went completely still. Jason Whitmore turned from the plaintiff's table so fast his chair scraped the floor. His attorney Craig Harwell was already on his feet. In the gallery, Eleanor Whitmore, pearls, leather portfolio, 30 years of careful reputation, went very, very quiet in a way that was louder than anything else in the room. And Jasmine Carter, sitting at the respondent's table in a navy blazer she had pressed twice the night before, looked at the man who had spent 3 weeks declaring her an unfit mother and watched him take it apart with his own hands. She did not cry. She did not reach for Deshawn's arm. She just sat there with her pen still touching the notepad in front of her and breathed once, slowly, through her nose. Deshawn Moss leaned close and said quietly, "Don't react." She didn't need the reminder. In the back of the gallery, a man in a dark jacket who had not spoken since he walked in 40 minutes ago watched all of this with the particular stillness of someone who already knew what was coming. He was younger than the room expected a man with his kind of authority to be. Late 30s. Unhurried. He had come to this courthouse for something else entirely. He had not left. His name was Joon-ho Kim, and the last time Jason Whitmore's name had crossed his desk, Jason owed him $2.3 million and was pretending he didn't. Before we go on, let me ask you something quickly. Do you think a custody battle is ever really just about a child, or is there always something deeper behind it? Stay till the end to find out what really happened. Like, comment, and subscribe. 3 years earlier, on a Tuesday night in November, Jasmine Carter drove 40 minutes in her socks with her 5-year-old daughter asleep in the back seat and did not look in the rearview mirror once. The glass Jason threw hadn't hit Zoe. That was the thing Jasmine kept turning over in her head as she drove. It hadn't hit her. It had hit the wall 2 feet to Zoe's left and exploded into pieces on the kitchen floor, and Zoe had made a sound. A small, involuntary sound. Not a cry, not a scream, just a flinched noise, fast and instinctive. The sound of a child whose body had already learned to brace before her mind understood why. Jasmine heard that sound, and something in her finished. She didn't pack. She didn't make a list, or write a note, or call anyone. She picked Zoe up from the floor where she'd been sitting with her coloring book, carried her to the car, buckled her in, and drove. She was wearing the socks with the small hole in the left heel that she'd been meaning to throw away for 2 months. She pulled into her cousin Renee's driveway at 11:42 p.m. Renee came to the door in a sleep shirt, looked at Jasmine's face, and stepped aside without a word. That was the night the marriage ended. The divorce filing came 3 days later. What came after the filing was 39 months of Jason Whitmore dismantling her life from the inside of a legal process she couldn't fully afford to fight. He challenged every asset, disputed every account. His attorney filed motions the way some people send emails, constantly, reflexively, in volumes designed to exhaust. Deshawn Moss was good, and Jasmine had used the last of her savings to hire him, but good costs money and Jason had more of it. Or appeared to. That distinction would matter later. The custody arrangement they'd landed on temporarily gave Jasmine primary custody, with Jason having alternate weekends. Jason hadn't fought hard enough for more time than that, which Deshawn had noted and Jasmine had noticed, but neither of them had fully understood at the time. They understood it now. Jason didn't want more time with Zoe. He wanted Zoe's guardianship on paper. Those were 2 entirely different things, and Eleanor Whitmore had spent the better part of a year building the machinery to get them. Eleanor had a gift. Not for cruelty exactly, though she was capable of it. Her gift was for identifying what held things together and applying pressure to exactly that point. She had done it in her marriage, in her social circle, in the 2 charitable foundations she chaired where the smile and the threat lived so close together that most people couldn't tell which one they were responding to. She had identified the thing holding Jasmine's case together, Deshawn Moss, and the absence of a psychological evaluation. Family courts weighted psychological evaluations heavily. Everyone in the system knew this. The right report, from the right clinician, citing the right diagnostic language, could shift a judge's perception of a parent faster than almost any other document. Eleanor understood this the way she understood most things, completely, and without sentiment. She found Dr. Philip Hargrove through the financial management company her attorney used for estate arrangements. Hargrove had a gambling problem and a debt history that had been quietly restructured twice. He was not a bad clinician by training. He was a compromised one by circumstance, which was more useful. The ask was specific. Produce an evaluation documenting emotional instability, dissociative episodes, paranoid ideation, inability to maintain a stable environment. Every clinical term real. Every cited instance fabricated. He would be compensated through debt relief. Nothing traceable to cash. Hargrove agreed. He was past the point of pretending he had better options. Eleanor also handled the judge assignment through Victor Osei. a scheduling coordinator at the courthouse who owed money to a lending firm connected to the Whitmore family's financial network. Victor quietly rerouted the case from its randomly assigned judge to Judge Patricia Holloway, a woman who wasn't corrupt, just sympathetic to the right kind of family, and who had attended 3 of Eleanor's foundation events without ever being asked for anything directly. Eleanor preferred it that way. The witnesses, Sandra Ogle and Pete Larkin, were the final layer. Partial research, coaching, and in Sandra's case a rental arrangement that had kept her in a property below market rate for 2 years. Neither of them knew the full shape of what they were part of. They just knew what they'd been asked to say. It was an elegant structure, for separate pressure points, none of them obviously connected, all of them aimed at the same outcome. Jasmine Carter declared legally unfit, guardianship of Zoe transferred to Jason, case closed. What Eleanor had not accounted for was the elevator being under maintenance on the 3rd floor of the courthouse on the morning of the hearing. Jasmine had been inside courtroom 4B for 40 minutes before the hearing officially started. She'd arrived early because she needed to sit in the room alone before it filled with people who had decided what she was. She sat at the respondent's table with her folder open and read the same page of notes 3 times without absorbing any of it. And then she stopped pretending and just sat there. The room was standard issue. Wood paneling, fluorescent light, that specific smell of recycled air and old paper that every government building seemed to share. The judge's bench at the front, the gallery behind her, the witness stand to the left. Nothing about it communicated that anything important happened here. Jasmine had pressed her blazer twice. She was aware that was something her mother would have done, and the awareness made her want to press it a 3rd time. Renee had offered to come. Jasmine had said no. Renee was watching Zoe, and Zoe was what mattered, and she needed Renee exactly where she was, 30 miles away at the apartment, doing a puzzle with a 6-year-old who thought her mother was doing boring work stuff today. Deshawn arrived at 8:15 with 2 coffees and a face that said he'd been up since 5. He set 1 coffee in front of Jasmine, sat down, opened his bag, and said, "Hargrove is their first witness. I'm going to hit the session logs hard. If he can't produce appointment records that match the evaluation dates, we have a foundation problem for the whole report. Will Holloway let you? She'll have to. The dates are in the document they submitted. It's their evidence." He looked at her. "You okay?" "I will be when it's over." He nodded once and went back to his notes. Jason arrived at 8:40 with Craig Harwell, who was one of those attorneys who moved through rooms like the room was already his. Expensive suit, expensive watch, the particular walk of a man who charged $600 an hour and needed you to feel it. He set his files down at the plaintiff's table without looking at Jasmine. Jason looked. Not long. Just once, quickly, and then away. She'd learned to read his looks over 8 years of marriage. This one said he had already decided the outcome and was mildly bored by the process of getting there. Eleanor came in behind them and took a seat in the front row of the gallery. She set her leather portfolio on her knee and looked at the bench. Judge Holloway entered at 9 sharp. Everyone stood. The hearing opened with Craig Harwell presenting Hargrove's evaluation. He read sections of it aloud slowly, placing each term in the air like furniture. Inability to self-regulate under stress, evidence of dissociative response during clinical observation, persistent paranoid ideation regarding the paternal family. Jasmine kept her pen touching the notepad. She wrote nothing. She watched Hargrove on the stand and noticed that he was holding his hands flat on his knees the way people do when they are managing something. Deshawn cross-examined him for 20 minutes. He was methodical in the way a good surgeon is methodical. No wasted movement, everything deliberate. He pressed on session dates, asked for the specific diagnostic criteria applied, asked whether standardized assessments had been administered or whether the evaluation was based on observational notes. Hargrove's answers were careful, rehearsed but careful. He kept his eyes on the middle distance, not at Craig Harwell, not at Eleanor, not at Jasmine. The middle distance was safe. Then Craig Harwell called Sandra Ogle. Sandra was a woman in her mid-50s with the specific confidence of someone who has rehearsed and believes rehearsal is the same as truth. She testified that she lived 2 streets from Jasmine and had witnessed Jasmine screaming at her daughter in the driveway on multiple occasions. She testified that she had once seen Zoe left alone in the car for over an hour on a hot day. Jasmine wrote on her notepad, "I have never seen this woman in my life." She slid it toward Deshawn. He read it without looking up. When his cross-examination came, he asked Sandra to describe Jasmine's house. Sandra described it generally, single-story, front yard, standard suburban. Deshawn asked about the front door. Sandra said she believed it was brown. Deshawn asked her to be sure. Sandra said yes, brown. Jasmine's front door had been red for 3 years. She had painted it with Zoe on a Saturday afternoon in spring. Zoe had gotten more paint on herself than the door. There were pictures. Deshawn noted it on the record without comment and moved on. He was banking the inconsistencies. He had enough for the foundation argument, maybe. Not enough to stop what was coming. Craig Harwell called Pete Larkin, who claimed to have worked alongside Jasmine and described erratic behavior and concerning statements about her home life. Deshawn asked for the name of Jasmine's direct supervisor during the period in question. Larkin gave a name from the accounting department. Not marketing. Someone had done research. Not enough of it. Deshawn added it to the bank. Then Craig Harwell stood and submitted his anchor motion. Immediate suspension of Jasmine's custodial rights pending full guardianship review. Sole custody to Jason Whitmore within 72 hours. Judge Holloway accepted it for consideration. In the gallery, Eleanor opened her portfolio and uncapped her pen. Deshawn put his hand flat on the table in front of Jasmine and did not move it. It was not a comforting gesture. It was a signal. Stay still, I'm working. She stayed still. And then the recess was called, and the room shifted in a way no one in it could fully explain, and everything that happened next happened because a man who had come to this building for an entirely different reason had heard a name in a hallway and decided to stay. Joon-ho Kim had been in the United States for 4 years. He had come from Incheon, the second son of a man who ran import businesses above the table and financial arrangements below it with equal discipline. Joon-ho had studied economics. He had worked at a legitimate firm. He had understood from the age of 22 that the legitimate firm and the family network operated by the same principles, and that the only real difference was which column the transactions appeared in. He had not chosen this life exactly. He had simply been the son who didn't leave. His older brother was in Vancouver running a restaurant supply company and calling their mother on her birthday. Joon-ho ran a network that processed offshore settlements and debt transfers for people whose problems required discretion rather than attorneys. He did not use violence as a first option. He used it approximately never. Violence was expensive and drew attention, and Joon-ho found, consistently, that financial architecture was more effective and left less mess. He was 38. He had the kind of face that was harder to read the longer you looked at it. Not cold exactly, just considered. Every expression looked like it had been decided on rather than arrived at naturally, which made the occasional moments when something genuine crossed it, surprise, or something close to amusement, land with more weight than they would have on someone whose face moved more freely. He had been in Birchfield for 3 days settling the logistics of the shipping family arbitration. The third-floor mediation suite was reserved. Min-jun had the documentation. This was supposed to be routine. The elevator had a maintenance hold. He stepped out on the second floor to wait and heard Jason Whitmore's name through an open courtroom door. He stood in the hallway for 4 seconds. Then he told Min-jun to find out which room and who the attorney was for the woman at the respondent's table. And he walked in and sat down and did not move for the next 40 minutes. He had encountered Jason Whitmore's name 18 months ago. Jason had been moving money through a private equity front company that overlapped with a holding structure Joon-ho's network used for offshore transfers. The overlap had created a joint transaction, a $2.3 million debt transfer that required coordinated timing from both sides to execute cleanly. Jason had pulled his capital mid-process without warning. The timing collapsed. Joon-ho's client had been left exposed. The network had compensated the client and internally noted the debt. Jason Whitmore owed them $2.3 million and appeared to be operating on the assumption that if he didn't acknowledge it, it would eventually stop being true. Joon-ho did not operate that way. He sat in the back of courtroom 4B and watched Jason at the plaintiff's table with his expensive attorney and his mother in the front row and began to understand the architecture of what he was looking at. Jason needed money. Jason needed it from a trust attached to a 6-year-old girl. Jason needed custody to access the trust. And Jason was using this woman. This woman who was sitting up straight in a navy blazer with her pen touching a notepad as the instrument of his survival plan. Joon-ho watched Jasmine for a long moment. She was writing something, passing it to her attorney, watching the witness, not performing composure, actually composed, in the way of someone who has been told by enough people that they are losing that they have stopped measuring themselves against winning and started measuring themselves against standing up. He sent Min-jun a message, reschedule the arbitration. I need you on something else. Drop a comment below. What do you think Joon-ho is about to do? Don't forget to like and subscribe, because the next part is where it really shifts. During the recess, the courthouse stayed loud in that specific way institutions get loud. Chairs scraping, voices spilling into corridors, the mechanical sounds of a building digesting its own business. Joon-ho used 11 minutes. He made 3 calls from the corridor outside the courtroom, speaking Korean and keeping his voice at the level of someone ordering coffee. The calls were short. He did not explain context or ask questions. He gave information and received confirmation and ended each one. Min-jun appeared at his shoulder as he finished the 3rd call. Victor Osei, scheduling coordinator. Second office on the left past the clerk's window. Min-jun handed him a folded paper. Lending firm account number, outstanding balance, last 3 transactions. He's been behind 4 months. Joon-ho pocketed it. And the paralegal? Craig Harwell's office. She's been managing all document coordination for this case. Her laptop is the access point. Do it. Min-jun left. Joon-ho looked through the small window in the courtroom door. Hargrove was still in the witness area, sitting alone, staring at the floor with his hands loose between his knees. A man in the specific posture of someone whose borrowed time had run out. Joon-ho took out his phone and dialed a number that wasn't in his contacts because he didn't need it in his contacts. Hargrove's cell rang 3 times before he answered. The voice Hargrove heard was not familiar. It was even, unhurried, and said 3 things. First, Every communication between Hargrove and Eleanor Whitmore's intermediary had been copied. Second, the evaluation Hargrove had submitted was not the only document that now existed. Third, act accordingly. The call lasted 40 seconds. Through the window, Joon-ho watched Hargrove look at his phone after the call ended. Watched him put it in his pocket. Watched him sit very still for a moment, and then look up at the courtroom ceiling like he was calculating whether the next 5 minutes could be survived. He could be. That was the point. Joon-ho went back inside. Victor Osei was at his desk in the scheduling office when the message arrived. He read it twice. His name, the account number, 3 transactions. The text said, "The redirect you processed 6 weeks ago has been documented. Stay seated. Touch nothing." Victor set his phone face down on the desk and did not pick it up again. He was 41 years old and had been with the courthouse for 9 years and had one significant failing that had put him in a position he'd spent 6 months pretending he could manage. He had borrowed money from a lending firm recommended by a Whitmore family attorney when his mother got sick and the hospital bills stacked up in a way he hadn't planned for. It had seemed like a solution at the time. It had stopped seeming like a solution almost immediately. The firm charged interest in ways that weren't fully visible in the contract language, and by the time Victor understood the structure of what he'd signed, he was already behind. When Eleanor's intermediary contacted him about rerouting a single case assignment to Judge Holloway's docket, it had been framed as a minor adjustment, an administrative courtesy. The kind of thing that happened in courthouses when the right people understood each other. Victor had done it. He had told himself it was one case. He had not been able to look at the case file since. He sat at his desk now and did not move and stared at the wall and thought about his mother and about the single case and about what stay seated, touch nothing could possibly mean for what came next. In Courtroom 4B, the recess ended. Craig Harwell's paralegal, a sharp young woman named Dana who had been managing the witness coordination and document threads for the last 6 weeks, opened her laptop to pull up the exhibit list and found that her screen was locked. Not crashed. Locked, with an access error she didn't recognize, and every folder she tried to reach returned the same result. She tapped Craig Harwell on the shoulder and turned the screen toward him. He looked at it. Then he looked at the room. He was a man who had been in enough rooms to know when the temperature had changed without the source of the change being visible. He had that feeling now, strongly, and he did not know what to do with it except file another objection and hope the judge was still on his side. He did not know the judge was about to have her own problem. Deshawn had used the recess to go over his cross-examination notes and refine the sequence he was going to use on Hargrove. His plan was methodical. Press the session logs, expose the diagnostic shortcut, argue the foundation of the evaluation was compromised. He thought he had maybe a 40% chance of getting it thrown out. He was preparing to work with 60. Then the courtroom door opened and a courthouse administrative worker he'd never seen before walked directly to the respondent's table and placed a printed document in front of him. No explanation, no eye contact. The worker turned and was gone before Deshawn could ask a question. He picked it up. It was the original scheduling request for the case. Plain administrative document, date stamped, nothing dramatic about it. Except in the routing field there was a manual override logged 6 weeks ago, and attached to the override was Victor Osei's clerk ID, and the override destination was Judge Holloway's docket. Deshawn read it twice. He looked up. He looked around the courtroom. He looked at Jasmine, who raised her eyebrows slightly. He looked back at the document. Someone had rerouted this case by hand to land in front of a specific judge. The document existed. It was sitting in his hands. And Victor Osei's clerk ID was on it in plain print. He put it in his folder and sat back and recalibrated everything. Judge Holloway called the hearing back to order. Craig Harwell had Hargrove back on the stand to finish his testimony before Deshawn's continued cross. He asked 2 short follow-up questions about the evaluation's conclusions, standard procedure, wrapping the direct examination cleanly. Deshawn stood for cross. He started with the session logs again, pressing harder this time. Specific dates, specific locations, the name of the administrative office that would have processed each appointment if Hargrove was seeing Jasmine through the court-appointed clinical program. He asked whether intake forms existed, whether billing had been processed, whether a supervising clinician had reviewed the sessions as required by the program's operating guidelines. Hargrove's answers slowed. He was not lying badly. He was lying carefully, which is a different and more recognizable thing. The pauses were just slightly too long. The phrasing was just slightly too considered. Deshawn asked one more question. Dr. Hargrove, who provided you with the diagnostic language used in this evaluation? Hargrove looked at Craig Harwell for 1 second. It was a fast look, reflexive, the kind of look a person makes when they are checking whether the door they entered through is still there. Craig Harwell's face gave him nothing. Hargrove looked back at Deshawn and said nothing for 4 full seconds. Judge Holloway said, "Dr. Hargrove, please answer the question." Hargrove put his hands flat on the arms of the witness chair. He did not look at Eleanor. He did not look at Jason. He looked at the middle distance he had been using as an anchor for the last hour, and then he seemed to decide something, and he said, "The diagnostic language in the evaluation was provided to me pre-drafted by Craig Harwell's office." The room stopped. Craig Harwell was on his feet before the sentence was finished. "Objection, the witness is." "Sit down, Mr. Harwell." Holloway's voice had the quality of something that had been decided before it was spoken. Harwell sat. She looked at Hargrove. Continue. He did. He said that he had not conducted a proper evaluation of Jasmine Carter, that the sessions cited in the report had not occurred as documented, that he had agreed to sign the evaluation in exchange for the resolution of personal financial arrangements managed through Eleanor Whitmore's intermediary network. He said it flatly, without performance, like a man who had been holding a debt he could no longer afford to carry. In the gallery, Eleanor Whitmore did not move. Her face did not change, but her hand on the leather portfolio tightened in a way that Jasmine, 10 feet away and watching, felt land somewhere deep in her chest. Jason turned to look at his mother. Eleanor did not look back. Deshawn was writing, not frantically, just steadily, getting everything down, every word, because every word was evidence now. Jasmine's pen was still touching the notepad. She had not written anything on it in the last 3 minutes. She did not need to. The psychologist had just taken apart the case that was supposed to take her apart, and she was still sitting there, and she was still present, and she had not broken, and the room knew it. That look Jason gave his mother when Hargrove confessed. Let me know in the comments what you think was going through his head. Like, subscribe, and stay with me. The docket document is about to go on the record, and it changes everything. Judge Holloway called a 10-minute recess after Hargrove's confession. It was not a casual recess. It was the kind of recess a judge calls when she needs to look at a case she thought she understood and figure out what she is actually holding. Craig Harwell moved immediately to Jason and spoke into his ear. Jason listened with his jaw set and his eyes on the table. Eleanor came forward from the gallery and stood behind both of them and said nothing, which was its own kind of instruction. Jasmine and Deshawn went to the corner near the window. The docket document, Deshawn said quietly. I'm entering it into evidence the moment we go back on record. I want you ready for what happens when I do. What happens? Holloway finds out she was specifically selected for this case. She is not going to like that. Is that good for us? It is if she does what judges are supposed to do when they find out someone put them in a room without telling them why. Jasmine looked across the room at Eleanor, who was still standing behind Jason. Eleanor caught the look and held it for a moment. Not hostile, not nervous, just measuring. The look of someone adjusting calculations. Jasmine held it back and didn't look away first. Deshawn touched her arm. Save it. Use it in 2 minutes. They went back on record. Deshawn stood and said he had a procedural matter to raise before Craig Harwell's next motion was addressed. He entered the docket redirect document into evidence, described its contents for the record, manual rerouting of the case, date stamp, clerk ID, and formally requested that Judge Holloway address the irregularity in how the case had been assigned to her docket. Judge Holloway looked at the document for a long moment. Then she looked at Victor Osei, who was not a party to the case, but whose name was on a document that had just been entered into evidence, and who was, as it happened, sitting in the back of the gallery because courthouse staff sometimes observed hearings in their building. He had come in during the recess. He had sat in the back row. He had not planned to stay. He had not been able to make himself leave. Judge Holloway said, on the record, Mr. Osei, can you explain this routing entry? Victor Osei stood up from the gallery. He was a tall man, and the standing made him more visible than he wanted to be. The entire room turned to look at him. He said, I was asked to redirect the case by a representative of the Whitmore family. 3 seconds of complete silence. Craig Harwell said, Objection. This witness has no standing in these proceedings. He has standing because I just asked him a question on the record, Holloway said. Sit down, Mr. Harwell. She looked back at Osei. You were asked by a representative. Yes. And you complied. Victor looked at the floor once, then back at the bench. Yes. Judge Holloway set the document down on her desk and was quiet for a moment in the way that judges are quiet when they are deciding something significant. In the gallery, Eleanor uncapped her pen and then didn't write anything. Jason's hands, on the plaintiff's table, were flat and very still. Deshawn didn't wait for the room to resettle. He turned to Hargrove, who was still in the witness area, and said he had additional questions. Craig Harwell objected on the grounds that the witness's prior testimony had fundamentally compromised the evidentiary value of the evaluation and that continuing the examination was procedurally pointless. Holloway said, overruled. Sit down. That was the second time she told him to sit down. The repetition had a quality to it. Deshawn stood in front of Hargrove and said, simply, was there any part of your evaluation of Jasmine Carter that was clinically accurate? Hargrove said no. Were any of the sessions you cited in the evaluation conducted as documented? No. Were any of the diagnostic conclusions based on actual clinical assessment? No. Each answer landed in the room like something being placed on a scale. Deshawn said, thank you. He turned back to his table. Craig Harwell stood and said that the testimony of a witness who had just admitted to professional misconduct and fraud should be stricken from the record entirely, and that the motion for emergency custody suspension should proceed on the basis of the other evidence presented, specifically the witness testimonies. Judge Holloway said, Mr. Harwell, Sandra Ogle testified that the respondent's front door was brown. The respondent's front door has been documented as red in photographs submitted to this court this morning. She looked at her notes. Pete Larkin identified Jasmine Carter's direct supervisor by the name of a colleague from a different department. These inconsistencies were entered into the record during cross-examination. Do you want to argue the weight of those testimonies right now? Harwell was quiet. I didn't think so. Holloway turned to address the room. We're taking a recess. Both attorneys approached the bench. What happened at the bench was not on the record, but Jasmine could read the shape of it from 15 feet away. Deshawn was calm and steady. Harwell was controlled, but working to stay that way. Holloway's expression had the particular quality of someone who has discovered they were standing in a room they thought they understood and are now looking at the walls differently. She was not corrupt. That was the thing about Eleanor's plan. It didn't require a corrupt judge, only a sympathetic one. And there was a specific quality of anger that belonged to people who had been used without being asked, who had been made a piece of something without their knowledge. That anger was clear on Holloway's face now. It was not going to help Jason. Jasmine sat at the respondents' table and watched the bench conference and thought about Zoe doing a puzzle at Renee's apartment 30 miles away, focused on the edge pieces first the way she always was, working from the outside in. Then the courtroom door opened behind her. She didn't turn around. She heard footsteps, a brief pause, and then the sound of something being placed on the table in front of her. She looked down. A manila folder, standard, no markings on the outside. She opened it. Wire transfer records. Jason Whitmore's name on the account. Numbers, dates, routing codes. And behind the wire transfers, 3 printed emails from a personal account she recognized as Jason's. She had seen that email address on enough joint documents during the marriage to know it without looking twice. The first email was to an address she didn't recognize. It discussed the structure of a Cayman-registered trust and the process for petitioning custodial access to trust funds through a guardianship transfer. The second was a logistical email about a property in Portugal. Rental terms, school enrollment process for a 6-year-old, timeline for international relocation. The third was to Eleanor. It said, once I have the guardianship transfer, the trust assignment is automatic. We'll be out of the country before she can file an appeal. Jasmine read it 3 times. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she usually wasn't. She was aware of the weight of the folder in her hands. She was aware that somewhere in the building, a man she had never met had decided, for reasons she didn't yet understand, to place this in front of her. She looked up. The person who had delivered it was already gone. Deshawn came back from the bench, sat down, and started talking about the judge's response. Jasmine slid the folder in front of him without a word. He looked at the first page, then the second, then the Portugal email, then the one to Eleanor. He stopped talking. He looked at Jasmine. She said, how fast can you enter that into evidence? Deshawn entered the documents into evidence before Craig Harwell finished his water. He stood, stated that he had received additional documentation during recess that was directly material to the motion currently before the court, and began laying out the wire transfer records and the emails for the record, reading the relevant sections aloud. When he read the Portugal email, once I have the guardianship transfer, the trust assignment is automatic. We'll be out of the country before she can file an appeal. Jason stood up. Not to speak. Just stood, as if his body had made the decision before his mind approved it. Craig Harwell put a hand on his arm. Jason did not sit. He stood there with his hand on the back of his chair and looked at the documents Deshawn was holding, and something moved across his face that Jasmine recognized the way you recognize a weather pattern. Not the specific storm, but the feeling that precedes it. She had lived with that face for 8 years. She knew what it meant when Jason ran out of maneuver room. Judge Holloway said, Mr. Whitmore, sit down. He sat. Holloway asked Deshawn to identify the source of the documentation. Deshawn said it had been delivered to the respondent's table by a courthouse employee during the bench conference. He said he could not identify the specific employee. He said the documentation appeared to be authentic and requested the court allow time for chain of custody verification before ruling on admissibility. Craig Harwell objected on foundation grounds. He said the documents couldn't be verified. The source was unknown. The chain of custody was non-existent, and entering them would be prejudicial. Holloway looked at the email to Eleanor for a long time. She said, I'm going to allow them provisionally, pending verification. And Mr. Harwell, I want to address something. She looked at him directly. I am now aware that this case was manually redirected to my docket by a scheduling coordinator acting at the request of a party to this case. I want you to understand what that means for how I am reading everything that has been placed before me today. The room was very quiet. She said, it means I am reading it carefully. Craig Harwell requested another recess. Holloway gave him 5 minutes. In those 5 minutes, the courtroom splintered. Harwell pulled Jason and Eleanor into the corridor. Jasmine could not hear what was being said, but she could see them through the small window in the door, and the geometry of the conversation was readable. Harwell talking fast, Eleanor standing straight and listening. Jason with his back to the window, shoulders set in that particular way that meant he was refusing to accept the shape of what he was being told. Deshawn was already on his phone, calling a contact at the county DA's office. He spoke quietly, reading out account numbers from the wire transfer documents, asking specific questions about what a voluntary submission of evidence would require. Jasmine sat in the empty courtroom and looked at the email to Eleanor that was now in the court record. will be out of the country before she can file an appeal. She thought about Zoe at the airport. Zoe on a plane to Portugal. Zoe waking up somewhere she'd never been, in a house she didn't know, with a father who had chosen her as a financial instrument. She thought about the night in the kitchen with the broken glass, the flinch sound Zoe made, the drive in her socks. She thought about how close this had been. She was still thinking about it when she noticed the man in the dark jacket. He was sitting in the back of the gallery. She had registered him earlier in the way you register furniture, present, not significant. But now, with the room empty and the hearing in suspension, she looked at him properly for the first time. He was watching her. Not the way people watch someone when they're caught looking. Directly. With the specific quality of attention that lands differently from regular attention, not intrusive, but complete. Like he had decided she was worth watching and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. She looked back. He didn't look away. She turned back to the front of the room. She heard him shift slightly in the gallery seat behind her. She was aware of the distance between them, which was not very far. She was also aware that she had no idea who he was or why he was still in the room, and that in the current context, those were significant things not to know. She turned back around. "Who are you?" she said. He said, "Someone who had a meeting on the 3rd floor. The 3rd floor is closed." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. He did not seem like someone who was going to explain himself further unprompted. She said, "Did you send those documents to my table?" He considered the question the way someone considers a question they have already answered in their own head and are deciding how much of that answer to give. "Yes," he said. She held that. "Why?" He said, "Because you needed them." That's not an answer. It's the relevant part of the answer. Deshawn came back in, saw Jasmine half turned in her chair looking at someone in the gallery, and stopped. He looked at Joon-ho. Joon-ho looked at him. Deshawn said to Jasmine, quietly, "Do you know who that is?" "No." Deshawn looked at Joon-ho for another moment, and then made a decision that Jasmine read correctly. He decided this was not the problem he was currently solving. He sat down and opened his notes. Joon-ho settled back in his seat. The 5 minutes ended. Harwell and Jason came back in without Eleanor. Eleanor Whitmore had not left the building. She was in the corridor, phone in hand, calling the attorney she used for estate arrangements. She spoke precisely and briefly and listened to the response, and did not react visibly to whatever she heard. She ended the call, stood against the wall for a moment, and then made a second call to a contact whose name she did not speak aloud. She said, "It's further along than I expected. I need options." The response she received was long. Her expression during it was the expression of someone doing continuous mental arithmetic. She said, "Understood." She ended the call. She did not go back into the courtroom. Instead, she walked, at a measured pace, toward the building's exit. At the parking garage entrance, she found that her car had been boxed in by 3 vehicles parked in adjacent spaces. All legally, all properly within their lines. All belonging to people who were apparently still inside the building and in no immediate hurry to leave. She stood and looked at this for a moment. Then she took out her phone and called her driver. The driver did not answer. She called again. He didn't answer. She stood in the garage in her pearls and her jacket with her leather portfolio under her arm and looked at her car sitting behind 3 other cars, and the arithmetic she had been doing since the hearing started reached a result she didn't like. She went back inside. Harwell resumed. His strategy had visibly shifted. He was no longer trying to win the motion. He was trying to control the damage. He argued that the confession of a compromised witness should not be treated as direct evidence of his client's misconduct, that the wire transfers required forensic authentication, and that the email correspondence, regardless of content, had been obtained through undisclosed means that made admissibility questionable at best. He was not wrong about any of these things. Legally, technically, he had arguments. He was making them in a room where the judge now knew she had been selected without her knowledge, where a court-appointed psychologist had confessed on the stand, where a scheduling coordinator had admitted to manually rerouting the case, and where emails documenting an intent to remove a child from the country were sitting in evidence. He was making good arguments in a room that had stopped being about arguments. Judge Holloway let him finish. Then she said, "I'm suspending these proceedings effective immediately." The room took that. "I am recusing myself from this case on grounds of procedural compromise. The case will be referred to the State Family Court Oversight Office for emergency review. I am also referring the wire transfer documentation and the email correspondence to the County District Attorney's Office for independent review." She looked at Jason. "Mr. Whitmore, I would strongly recommend you consult your attorney about your current exposure before you take any further action in relation to your daughter or her financial arrangements." Jason said nothing. Holloway stood. "We're adjourned." The judge just blew the whole thing up. The room emptied in that particular way courtrooms empty after something real has happened. People moving faster than they normally would, voices low, everyone processing individually and not wanting to be the one who stands still. Craig Harwell told Jason to say nothing to no one and moved toward the clerk's window immediately. He had calls to make and damage to map, and he was already calculating what this would cost him professionally, which was a different calculation from what it would cost Jason, and the two calculations were about to diverge significantly. Jason stood at the plaintiff's table. He did not gather his files. He He stood there with one hand on the table and looked at the wall behind the judge's bench, and his jaw moved once, slightly, the way it moved when he was deciding something. Jasmine had seen that jaw movement across a dinner table, across a living room, across the kitchen the night with the glass. She knew what came after it. Something breaking, an object, an arrangement, a person, whatever was closest. There was nothing close enough now. He looked at Jasmine, direct, unshielded, the kind of look that in their marriage had always preceded the part where she had to manage the situation before it escalated. She looked back at him and did not manage it. She held his gaze and said nothing and let the silence be his problem. He picked up his folder and walked out. Deshawn was already packing, already moving into the next stage. Emergency motions, supervised visitation, contempt filing. He talked while he packed, laying out next steps for Jasmine in the efficient way of someone who had already moved past what just happened and was operating on what happens next. She appreciated that he was working. She needed 60 seconds to not work. Take a minute, he said, reading her. I'll be at the clerk's window. Don't leave the building yet. He went. The room was empty. Jasmine sat at the respondent's table in the empty courtroom and looked at the bench where Holloway had been sitting 10 minutes ago and said a case she had been losing since it was filed, and that was built on 4 layers of fraud, had just been referred for emergency review, and the emails were with the DA. She was not safe. Not fully. Not yet. But she was not in the trap anymore. She picked up her folder, stood, straightened her blazer, and walked out. He was in the corridor. She almost walked past him. He was standing slightly apart from the activity. Staff moving, attorneys on phones. Victor Osei sitting on a bench with 2 court oversight officials, with the particular quality of someone who is present in a room but does not belong to its chaos. She stopped. In the courtroom, he had been a presence at the back of the gallery. In a corridor, he was just a person, and she could see him more clearly. Younger than she expected somehow, given what he appeared to have just done. The kind of face that was harder to read the longer you looked at it. Not closed, just considered. He said, "Your daughter. Is she safe right now?" "She's with my cousin." "Good." He was quiet for a moment. "No one from that family will be able to access her finances. The trust has been restructured. It's protected until she chooses her own counsel at 18. Jasmine looked at him for a long moment. "How did you do that?" "Through channels that don't require a courthouse." That's not an answer either. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "I know," she said. "You came here for a meeting on the 3rd floor." "Yes." "And you stayed." "Yes." "Why?" He considered this the way he had considered the earlier question, not evasively, but genuinely, as if the honest answer required actual thought. He said, "I heard your ex-husband's name. He and I have unfinished business. I came in to understand the situation." "And what did you understand?" "That the situation was more than unfinished business." She held that. "What else did you understand?" He looked at her directly, and she had the sense that whatever he said next was going to be something he had not planned to say, which was a different quality from everything he'd said before. He said, "That you should not have been in that room alone." The corridor was loud around them. Someone's phone was ringing. 2 attorneys were arguing in the space near the elevator. Victor Osei was saying something to the oversight officials in a low, resigned voice. None of it was relevant. Jasmine said, "I wasn't alone. I had my attorney." "I know." He looked down briefly and then back at her. "That's not what I meant." She knew it wasn't. She wasn't going to make it easier for him. She had a rule, developed over 8 years of a marriage that had taught her the specific danger of being moved too quickly by the right kind of attention. She was going to stand in this corridor and hold her folder and make him do the work of saying what he meant. He said, "I mean, you were in a room where the entire structure had been built to guarantee your loss. And you sat there with your pen on a notepad and held it together and did not ask for anything from anyone. And I have been in a lot of rooms, and that is not." He stopped. He looked away briefly and then back. "That is not what most people do." Jasmine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What's your name?" "Joon-ho Kim." "Jasmine Carter." "I know." Then, I read the case file. She almost laughed. Not at anything funny, at the specific absurdity of this corridor, and this day, and this person. "Of course you did." He reached into his jacket and placed a card on the windowsill beside her. No name on it. A number. "If anyone from that network approaches you, your daughter, or your attorney," he said, "call that number." She picked up the card, looked at it, put it in her blazer pocket. "Is this you protecting me?" she said. "No," he said. "This is me making sure you don't have to need protecting." He turned to go. She said, "Joon-ho." He stopped. "Thank you." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You did the hard part." He walked down the corridor and did not look back. Jasmine stood at the window and watched him go and held her folder against her chest and thought about Zoe and the puzzle and the edge pieces and the drive 40 minutes in her socks and everything between then and now. Her phone was ringing. "Renee?" She answered. Renee said, "How did it go?" Jasmine said, "It went." "That good or that bad?" "Different." She looked down the corridor where Joon-ho had turned a corner and was gone. "Different. I need to know, are you team Joon-ho? Because that corridor scene is what I've been waiting to write. Like, comment, subscribe, and stay with me because the next batch is the weeks after the courthouse. and that's where the Real story begins. Jason Whitmore was arrested 14 days after the hearing. The charges were fraud, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to commit custodial interference. The third charge came primarily from the Portugal emails and from a secondary set of communications that the DA's office obtained through a subpoena, communications between Jason and a contact overseas, discussing the logistics of relocating with a minor without the co-parent's consent or a court order. Craig Harwell withdrew from the case the morning of the arrest. His firm released a statement about the conclusion of their representation. Jason hired a new attorney by the end of the week. That attorney was less expensive and moved more slowly, and Jason, sitting in it, understood for the first time that the architecture of money and connections he had spent 15 years building had a structural problem. It had been supported, the whole time, by arrangements that couldn't survive being looked at directly. Dr. Philip Hargrove surrendered his clinical license pending ethics review. He issued no public statement. He hired an attorney who negotiated a cooperation agreement with the DA. Victor Osei was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. He cooperated fully from the first meeting. His attorney negotiated a reduced charge in exchange. He called his mother after the second meeting and talked for 40 minutes and did not explain the details, but said he was sorry, and she said she knew, and they talked about other things. Eleanor Whitmore released a statement through a public relations firm she had retained, expressing that she had always acted in the best interests of her grandson and that she had confidence the facts would be properly assessed. She said nothing else publicly. Privately, she retained a criminal defense attorney with a reputation for managing complex white-collar exposure. She had not spoken to Jason directly since the day of the hearing. That silence was its own kind of verdict. The custody case was reassigned to a new judge, the Honorable David Park, who reviewed the case file, the Oversight Office's preliminary findings, and the DA referral, and granted Deshawn's emergency motion for supervised visitation within 36 hours. Jason could see Zoe for 2 hours, twice per week, with a court-appointed supervisor present. Nothing unsupervised. Nothing overnight. Nothing out of state. Deshawn filed for sole custody on Jasmine's behalf and told her it would take 3 to 4 months for the full review and hearing. He told her the exposure of the fabricated evidence and the documented intent to flee the country were the two strongest elements in their favor, and that he expected the outcome to be different from what they had been fighting for the last year. Different how, she said. Better, he said. Zoe came home on a Wednesday. Jasmine had cleaned the apartment that morning, not because it needed it, but because doing something with her hands helped. She had bought the markers Zoe had been asking about, the metallic ones for drawing. She had also bought the cereal Zoe liked, the kind with the too much sugar that Jasmine usually rationed, and she had put it on the counter without hiding it in the back of the cabinet. Renee dropped Zoe off at 4. Zoe came in, dropped her backpack in the hallway exactly where she always dropped it regardless of how many times Jasmine had directed her toward the hook, looked around the apartment with the specific assessment of a 6-year-old returning to a space after an absence, and said, "Did you get the markers?" "Counter," Jasmine said. Zoe went to the counter, found the markers, and held up the package to inspect them. She said, "These are the right ones." "I know. Can I use them now? After dinner?" Zoe put the markers down carefully. She looked at Jasmine in the way she sometimes did, directly, longer than felt casual, the way she had always looked at people since she was very small, as if she were reading something. Then she crossed the kitchen and hugged Jasmine around the waist and pressed her face into her stomach. Jasmine put her hand on the back of Zoe's head and stood there. She did not need to cry in this moment, and she did not cry. She just stood there with her daughter's arms around her and the markers on the counter and the too much sugar cereal in the cabinet, and let the specific quality of being home settle into her. They slept in the same bed for a week. Neither of them said anything about it. It was just what happened. Jasmine would work on her laptop until late, and when she went to her room, Zoe would already be in the middle of the bed with one arm flung over the wrong side, and Jasmine would move her gently to make room, and Zoe would not fully wake up, and they would both sleep. On the third night, Zoe said in the dark, half asleep, "Is it over?" Jasmine said, "The bad part is over." Zoe said, "Okay. And then, can we paint the door?" "What color?" "Yellow." "Yeah," Jasmine said. "We can do yellow." He called on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the hearing. She had not contacted him. She had the card with the number, and she had looked at it several times and put it back in the pocket of the navy blazer without using it. She was not ready for whatever the using of it would mean. When his name came up on her phone, not a name, a number, but she knew it from the card she had memorized and refused to admit she'd memorized. She sat with it for 2 rings before answering. He said, "This is Joon-ho. I'm sorry to call without warning." "It's fine," she said. A brief silence. Not uncomfortable. "I wanted to make sure the situation with the case had moved in the right direction." New judge. Supervised visitation for him. Solo custody hearing in 3 months. Good. He was quiet for a moment. "And you?" She said, "I'm here." "That's good too." Another silence. She could tell he had called to ask something and was working up to it in the way of someone who was usually in control of conversations and was currently not in control of this one. She found this strangely comforting. He said, "I would like to have dinner with you and your daughter, if that feels right." She said, That is a remarkably normal thing to say. I'm aware it's not a normal situation. Why dinner? He said. Because I have been thinking about you since the courthouse and I didn't want to spend more time pretending I hadn't. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the blue marker Zoe had left on the counter. She thought about the rules she had made for herself after Jason, about the speed of trust and what moved her and what she was allowed to let move her. She thought about the corridor. You should not have been in that room alone. She said, I'll bring Zoe. I hoped you would. The restaurant was small, Korean, on a side street that didn't look like much from the outside. Inside it was warm and close and smelled like something Jasmine didn't know the name of, but immediately decided she liked. Joon-ho was already there when they arrived. He stood when he saw them, which Zoe noted and later reported to Renee as, the man stood up when we came in, which means he has manners. He had ordered tea for the table. He had also, without explaining why, ordered a small plate of the kind of food he suspected a 6-year-old might want before the food discussion started. Dumplings, plain, nothing complicated. Zoe looked at them and looked at him with a revised assessment. He and Jasmine talk the way two people talk when they have a significant amount of context about each other that arrive through unusual means, carefully, but not stiffly, filling in the parts that didn't exist yet. He asked about her work. She asked about his, which led to a conversation that was honest about its limits. There are parts one can tell you. There are parts one can't. I won't pretend otherwise, that she found more reassuring than a full explanation would have been. Zoe asked him if he knew any magic. He said, a little. He taught her a card trick using a deck he borrowed from the host stand. Zoe did it wrong 3 times. The 4th time she did it correctly and stood up on her chair and announced to the restaurant that she had done it. 3 tables clapped. Joon-ho looked at Jasmine over Zoe's head. Jasmine said, quietly, she does that. He said, I know. It's good. She looked at him across the table. The restaurant warm around them. Zoe settling back into her chair with the cards still in her hands, the tea going cold. She said, this is not simple. He said, no. You come with complications. Yes. I need you to be honest with me about that. About all of it. Not most of it. He held her gaze. I will be. She said, I'm not easy to be around right now. I'm in the middle of a custody case, and I have a 6-year-old, and I haven't. She stopped. Looked at her tea. I haven't trusted anyone in a long time. He said, I know. And then, carefully, I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking if I can be around while you figure out whether you do. Jasmine looked at him. She said, okay. Zoe looked between them with the perceptive expression of someone who understood the room better than the room thought she did, and went back to practicing the card trick. The sole custody hearing took 4 months, not 3. Judge Park moved methodically through the evidence, the oversight office's findings, and the DA's preliminary report on Jason's financial misconduct. Deshawn presented the case clearly and without theater. The fabricated evaluation, the docket manipulation, the documented Portugal plan, the wire transfers showing Zoe's trust as a target. He let the documents carry the weight, and they were heavy enough. Craig Harwell's replacement, a quieter attorney named Ellis Brandt, mounted the best defense available. Argued that Jason's personal financial misconduct was separate from his capacity as a parent, challenged the admissibility of documents whose chain of custody remained unverified, present character witnesses who had not been coached and could speak to Jason's general functioning as a father during scheduled visitation. It was a reasonable strategy, and it had a ceiling. The ceiling was the email to Eleanor. Once I have the guardianship transfer, the trust assignment is automatic. We'll be out of the country before she can file an appeal. No attorney could make that sentence mean something other than what it meant. Judge Park read it on the record, set it down, and asked Ellis Brandt directly whether his client had written it. Brandt said the email's authenticity was still under verification. Park said, your client has not challenged its authenticity in any written filing. I'll take that as a working assumption. He ruled in Jasmine's favor. Full legal and physical custody to Jasmine Carter. Jason would have supervised visitation twice monthly, pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. The trust structure for Zoe would remain under independent oversight until Zoe reached legal adulthood. No custodial petition regarding the trust's assets would be considered until that time. Deshawn called Jasmine with the ruling at 2 in the afternoon. She was at her desk at work and she listened to him lay out the decision, and when he was done she said thank you and ended the call and sat at her desk for a moment, and then went to the bathroom and stood at the sink and turned the cold water on and let it run over her wrists. Not crying, just needing something cold and real and present. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. Navy blazer again. She'd worn it for a client presentation that morning without thinking about it, and only noticed on the drive-in. She turned the water off, dried her hands, and went back to her desk. She called Renee first. Renee made a sound that was not quite a word, and then said, hold on, I need to sit down to be happy properly. She called her mother. Her mother prayed on the phone for 3 minutes without interruption, and Jasmine listened to every word. Then she called Joon-ho. He answered on the first ring. She said, we won. A pause. Then, quietly, I know. You know? Deshawn's office sends case updates to a contact I have in the oversight office. I've been watching. She considered whether to be annoyed by this. She decided she wasn't. Why didn't you call me? It wasn't my news to give you. She looked at her desk. At the photo of Zoe she kept at the corner. Zoe at the beach last August, squinting into the sun, holding a shell up to show the camera. She's mine, Jasmine said. Officially, legally, completely mine. He said, she always was. She said, I know. But now the paper says so. That evening she picked Zoe up from school herself. No Renee, no coordination, just Jasmine at the pickup line in her car, watching the doors. When Zoe came out and saw Jasmine's car, she made the specific face children make when they expected one thing and got a better thing, surprise delight, moving into pleasure, arriving at comfort. She climbed in and dropped her backpack and said, why are you here? Because I wanted to be. Zoe considered this as sufficient reasoning. She found her snack in her bag and ate it and told Jasmine about her day in the detailed, non-linear way of a 6-year-old for whom narrative sequencing was still a work in progress. There was something about a disagreement at lunch, a story her teacher had read, a drawing she'd made that she wanted to show Jasmine. Jasmine drove and listened and answered the questions and asked the ones that mattered. When they pulled into the parking lot of their building, Zoe looked up at the door she could see from the car. We never painted it, she said. I know. We're doing it Saturday. Yellow. Yellow. Zoe unbuckled and got out with her backpack and walked toward the building. Then she turned around and looked at her mother with that particular long look she had, the reading look. Mom. Yeah. Is Joon-ho going to come to the painting? Jasmine locked the car. I haven't asked him. You should ask him, Zoe said, with the certainty of someone for whom this was a resolved question. He's good at things. Jasmine looked at her daughter. What makes you think that? He got the card trick right the first time, Zoe said, and walked inside. He came to the painting. He arrived with a drop cloth and 2 new brushes because he had noticed the brushes they bought were the wrong kind for exterior paint and had said so, simply, without making it a correction. He brought coffee for Jasmine and a juice box for Zoe, and a small pastry that Zoe immediately claimed was her favorite despite having never eaten one before. The 3 of them painted the front door yellow on a Saturday morning while the building's other residents passed them coming and going, and Zoe narrated the entire process at considerable volume. At one point Zoe got paint on her shoe and looked at it, and then at Joon-ho, and said, this happened. He said, yes. She said, what do we do about it? He said, we keep painting. The shoe already happened. Zoe accepted this and kept painting. Jasmine, working on the upper half of the door, heard the exchange and did not say anything. She pressed her brush along the frame in a long, even stroke and felt something in her chest that she recognized as the specific quality of being in the right place. Not triumphant, not dramatic, just correct. Like a weight being placed exactly where it was designed to go. After, they ate the remaining pastries on the steps in front of the yellow door. Zoe fell asleep against Jasmine's arm 15 minutes after eating, the way she did when she ran out of momentum, sudden and complete. Jasmine and Joon-ho sat on the steps with the yellow door behind them and the autumn afternoon in front of them, and Zoe asleep across Jasmine's lap. He said, I need to tell you something. She said, okay. He looked at his coffee cup. Jason had a secondary plan, beyond the custody case. If the legal route failed, and there were people in his network who considered it a real possibility, there was an arrangement in place to remove Zoe through non-legal means. Before you could respond, Jasmine was very still. He said, I intercepted it. Before the hearing, the arrangement has been permanently dismantled and the people involved have been, he paused, redirected. She did not speak for a long moment. He said, I didn't tell you at the time because it was handled. And telling someone how close a thing came before you've made it safe. He stopped. That's just giving someone a wound with nothing attached to it. She looked at Zoe asleep across her lap, the yellow door behind them. The drop cloth still spread on the walkway. She said, how close? He said, close. One word. He did not embellish it, and he did not minimize it, and she understood both the choice and what it covered. She put her hand over Zoe's and held it there. She said, why didn't you tell me when it was over? He said, because you had a custody case to win, and then you won it. And I needed, he looked at her directly. I needed to tell you myself. Not over the phone. Not as information. As something I owed you. She held that. Then she said, you knew from the beginning. In the courtroom. You already knew what Jason was planning. Yes. You knew she was in danger. Yes. And you stayed. Yes. She looked at him. He looked back. She said, you stayed because of the debt. The money Jason owed you. He said, I stayed because of you. The afternoon was quiet around them. The yellow door behind them caught the light. Jasmine looked at the man sitting on her steps who had walked into a courthouse for a meeting on the 3rd floor and had not left, and who had quietly dismantled the thing that was meant to end her, and who had told her the truth in the right order, and who had brought the right brushes. She said, I have a rule. About trust. I know. It takes me a long time. I know that too. And you come with complications. Yes. She looked down at Zoe, then back at him. Keys under the mat when you bring her back from the park tomorrow. She's going to ask you to go to the park. Don't let her talk you into 2 hours. She'll try. He was quiet for a moment. He said, 1 hour. 1 hour, Jasmine said. And no ice cream before lunch. Understood. She looked straight ahead at the building across the street and said nothing more, and he said nothing more, and Zoe slept on, one hand curled under her chin. In front of the door they had just painted yellow, completely safe in a way that she would never fully know to thank anyone for. 3 months later, Jasmine found a single document in an envelope pushed under her apartment door. No name on the outside. Inside was a one-page confirmation from a Cayman Islands trust administrator. The document confirmed that the Carter family trust, Zoe Carter, beneficiary, age 6, had been restructured, independently overseen, and secured against all third-party custodial petition until the beneficiary reached the age of 18. It also confirmed that an anonymous supplemental contribution had been made to the trust the previous month. The contribution was $2.3 million. Jasmine stood in her doorway and read the document twice. She looked down the hallway. Empty. She looked at the number on the document, at the date, at the supplemental line. She knew exactly what $2.3 million meant. She knew exactly where it had come from. She knew it was Jason's debt, transferred, not forgiven, not lost, but redirected, placed into Zoe's future with the precision of someone who understood that the best form of consequence was not punishment but correction. She stood in the doorway for a long time. Then she took out her phone and she called him. He answered on the first ring, the way he always answered. She said, "The envelope." He said nothing. She said, "Joon-ho." He said, "She's going to need things. When she's 18. Things that require a foundation." Jasmine leaned against the doorframe. "You didn't have to do that." "I know. It's not." She stopped. "This is not a debt you owed her." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "No, it isn't." She understood what he meant. She stood in the doorway of the apartment with the yellow door and the markers on the counter and the cereal in the cabinet and thought about her father Robert, who had built something small and careful and real and left it for his grandchild, and about everything that had been done to take it, and about everything that had been done to make sure it held. She said, "You should come to dinner tonight." He said, "I'll bring food." She said, "Zoe will try to teach you the card trick. She already has. Twice. She's going to keep trying until it's perfect." "I know," he said. And then, quietly, with the particular quality of something true and unguarded, "I don't mind." Jasmine closed her front door, walked back into her apartment, and put the document on the counter next to the markers. Outside, the door was yellow. Inside, something was beginning. Not in the dramatic way of things that announce themselves, but in the quiet way of things that have already been decided without anyone saying so, and that will hold. And in a Cayman Islands trust account, for $0.1 million plus $2.3 million waited, untouchable, for a 6-year-old girl named Zoe Carter, who was currently at school learning to read, and would grow up knowing her mother had fought for her, without ever knowing how many different kinds of battles that had been. The last thing Jason Whitmore would lose was not the custody case, not the criminal charges, not the offshore accounts when the forensic accountants finished their work. The last thing he would lose was the $2.3 million he had spent 15 years pretending he didn't know. It was sitting in his daughter's future now. He would never touch it. If this story hit you the way I think it did, drop a comment, tell me which moment got you the most. Was it the yellow door? The envelope? Zoe and the card trick? This is the kind of story I want to keep telling. Real, cinematic, unforgettable. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear a story about a woman who survived everything they built to stop her and built something better on the other side. See you in the next one.